Thank you for the nice welcome. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here for the first time in my life at the Department of Statistics in Dortmund. I'm glad to see so many people interested in our research. And Carsten already introduced my more recent interest into using textual data as input to further statistical or econometric research. In fact, we started 2015, so roughly 10 years ago, with text mining when it was not so common yet, I guess. And it was just due to a problem we faced because at that time or around the time we had the 150 years anniversary of the Journal of Economics and Statistics. And I'm glad to be the managing editor of the journal. So we thought we should have something special for 150 years. And so the idea was, okay, what was the content of the journal of 150 years? And did the content somehow relate to economic reality? And well, first idea, long period. And given that Laspers published his article on the Laspers index in that journal, I thought, well, inflation might be a good thing to look at. We have long time here for inflation in Germany, back to 1880, I think. There are more or less reliable data. I thought it would be a good choice. And then we started counting the frequency of the word inflation. Well, I had no idea about text mining, so there was first guess what happened. So we were searching for the word inflation in German in the German text. We don't find any single notion of inflation until I think late 40s or 50s, because it was used, they used the word Teuerung or Preissteigerung or whatever, but inflation, the term just didn't exist. And then it was one of my PhD students showing me, okay, there are some papers, they use this topic modeling stuff. And then we tried it, and that was the first paper we had on text mining, just comparing topics in the journal, the relevance of the topics in the journal with the corresponding time series. We had that for unemployment, for inflation, for trade, and for some others. And then did Granger causality testing and found that actually for some of the topics, the not surprising happened. Well, we face high inflation, and then the researchers start to do research on inflation a bit later. But sometimes we also had the Granger causality the other way around. So the researchers already possibly saw a certain developing globalization of the world economy, trade becomes more important prior to the indicator going up. So we have seen both results. And that was the starting point. And so afterwards, we continue to do research using textual data of different types. And what I'm going to present today is the result of a DFG funded project together with Peter Tillmann and one of my PhD students, Adina, and one of my former PhD students, Dr. Navoka, since 2 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks, on the relation on finding novel fiscal policy indicators based on parliamentary speeches. Well, some of you are familiar with the macroeconomic modeling of fiscal policy. Typically, you build your VAR model, and then you try to identify the fiscal policy shock as something which remains unexplained. I'm not going to show you the slide until you ask for it. We will show that our fiscal policy indicator is in a way Granger causal for that what you typically generate. So that what you typically generate is not an exogenous shock because you can explain it to some extent. And the idea is quite simple, the motivation. Fiscal policy is made in parliament, at least in Germany. They vote finally about what's going on. And changes in fiscal policy are usually preceded by some discussion about what should be done or what shouldn't be done, or whether we should increase the taxes or decrease, or now, well, the most recent experience maybe was an exception. There was not much discussion before, but typically there's discussion before in the parliament, and then we see some changes. And so the idea was maybe we should use parliamentary speeches to construct an indicator of what we call the fiscal sentiment. That maybe not the perfect naming wording, but a way to describe whether the overall stance of policy is more expansionary or more restrictive. That was the first goal to generate this indicator. And then, of course, see whether it's actually a leading indicator for government spending shocks. That's what we expected or what we hoped. And so let us begin at the beginning with the parliamentary speeches, and we provide some new insight into fiscal policy shocks and their consequences. That's the motivation for the first part of the paper. And then the second part is maybe even more relevant for the current discussion going on. It's about disagreement, because of course it's not the parliament in its totality which thinks, okay, we should spend more or spend less, but there are different parties. There's a government, there's an opposition, and typically they disagree about the stance of fiscal policy. And then we thought, well, probably disagreement might be also important besides the stance of fiscal policy sentiment, the extent of disagreement. And there's just two reference to the German to the Ampel government last year. So the German business is set up with government in disarray. So that this feeling that they don't have a common interest or a common goal might have, when perceived by the economic agents, lead to uncertainty or might lead to a reduction of investment and so on. So it might itself have consequences. So there our hypothesis was, if there's more disagreement in the parliament, this might have a negative, will be a negative shock. And then we're thinking about that, maybe not deep enough, because then we calculate disagreement, and you'll see disagreement between government and opposition. And only afterwards realize that's not the point, because government and opposition have to disagree. That's the role of opposition, to disagree. The important part is the disagreement within the government, because in Germany, for the period we consider, 1970 to 2021, there have always been two parts in the government. And then the extent of disagreement between the two parties might be the case of uncertainty outside, which then has economic consequences. And we look at both of these indicators and we'll find that it's more the disagreement within the government. And so we measure fiscal disagreement and quantify the effects. So that's the goal of the story I'm going to tell you. And please feel free to interrupt me at any time or when your questions. Otherwise, I try to present what we have. And again, if there's time for questions at the end, yesterday I received the graphs of the indicators here for the last 3 years. Our official data end in 2021, but of course the parliament goes on. And so at least the indicators we already have updated for the Ampel government, and it might be interesting to have a look at it. But it's not part of the regular program, it's just an add-on. Okay, so main contribution of the two papers actually, which are involved here, constructing these new indicators, fiscal sentiment, and then disagreement about fiscal policy based on parliament speeches. There's a slide, well, something I didn't mention yet. Then we also differentiate between fiscal policy, which we call endogenous, so something unemployment increases, so we will have to spend more in the unemployment insurance system, automatically more or less. That's a different story from the war in Ukraine. We will increase our military spendings. And we try to separate the two things with a topic model. They're a bit ad hoc, but as you will see, that's also an interesting perspective, because they have a different impact, whether it's the endogenous side or the exogenous side. Well, with measuring disagreement, I mentioned this government or coalition governments. So you cannot transfer these ideas one-to-one to the US system for obvious reasons. And then estimate the macroeconomic effects by our standard VR models in a way. Central findings, we have variation of the indicator. That's what we need to make use of it. We see our significant and also strong, in absolute size, strong impact of the sentiment on real economics. In particular, this exogenous part has a stronger impact, which is always on, for longer periods, significant, whereas the endogenous part sometimes it's significant, but it's smaller. So it's this exogenous component which has a major role. This agreement has a cycling over the election periods. At the beginning of a new government, everybody is happy, it's honeymoon. We just see it these days in the news. And then over the period, it deteriorates, and at the end, it becomes more or less, well, they prepare for the next election, and then the disagreement increases. Maybe also not surprising, but we just checked with the data and we found, okay, that's actually in the data. And this strong increase, however, at the end is for 2024, it's really the largest jump we have ever, we haven't seen something like that before in the data. That's so we have to double check that everything is fine, but that's okay. Whereas government opposition disagreement doesn't play a role. It's not important. And within coalition disagreement, as I already explained, is has a negative, is contractionary, has a negative impact. It reduces industrial production, manufacturing orders, sentiment, and stock prices. There is, of course, a rather large literature on identifying fiscal policy shocks in the traditional way. This, I think, the paper, this with the narrative approach is probably the literature closest to what we are doing, but they do it in a qualitative way that just identify certain events and see what happens around these event times. And then some do it for financial markets, disagreement on financial market forecasts. But we haven't seen any paper doing that with parliamentary speech. Well, there's a literature also for the central banks. We have a literature on central bank, what they do, but not for the fiscal policy side. So that seems to be the first paper, and that's the contribution. The overall project pipeline, the project was a bit larger even than we did consider the Bundestag speeches, but also what is reported in the newspapers. There's also a paper I think written right now, but I'm not a co-author of that paper. Huge part of the work was in preparing the data, because most recent data of the speeches are available in a nice XML format, but the historic data is just text. The only information you have, the date, and then you have the text for the date. And there was a lot of work to split up this text in speeches and assign them to certain persons, and the persons to political parties, so to construct the indicators. Then there was the side story about identifying topics, for splitting out exogenous and endogenous things. Then we use word embedding approach for the indicator itself. That's a rather, I don't know whether I should call it established methodology, but we find some papers doing it the same way, not for fiscal policy, but for other purposes. And then we'll construct the indicators and do the econometric modeling afterwards. So that was, I think, my introduction more or less. I will shortly present some details on the data and then the indicators. So I will focus mainly on these indicators, how we did it, and what are also some limitations we realized while doing it. The talks we considered are everything from 1960 to 2021. Of course, we started the project in 2021. And we start not in 49 because the major macroeconomic data we use later on are available only since 1970 in quarterly data. And since we need 10 years training of the models before doing the forecast for the next quarter, we need textual data back to 1960. Well, then this was starting already with the master thesis, master thesis, and then continued for this project to split this reports because you cannot do it manually. So you need methods, and we did it more the traditional way with regex expressions and so on. And it was a bit of a nightmare because this report also, the structure changes over time. It's not constant from 1960 to 2019. Afterwards, it was XML, and it's okay, but many changes in the way they presented it. Then we selected, we excluded some speeches, so we don't care about what the president of the Bundestag is saying or the secretaries of the state or guest speakers, so more formalities. We removed very short speeches, below less than 100 words, and very long speeches, were more than 3,573 words. And yesterday, another PhD student presented her first ideas of research, and then she presented also this 99.5% quantile. And then I asked her, why 99.5? Usually we use 99 or 97.5 maybe, or 95. And then there was no answer. So I cannot give you an answer on the question why we use 99.5. It's clear we want to exclude, there are very long speeches on historic events and something which are really long, but not related to what we're interested in. But for this threshold, I think there's not a really, there's also not a real reason to use 99. Then we have typical pre-processing issues, remove the umlauts, remove the stop words. Then we added a list of domain-specific stop words, because a term like Bundestag is not a typical stop word, but of course it shows up many, many times in these speeches, or Abgeordnete or Drucksache. Then we did lemmatization, and we have still a very high dimension, 93,000 unique words compared to the other applications. I did at least, this is a huge vocabulary. Otherwise, we have more, 2,000 or 5,000 or so. It is quite broad. This is the frequency of speeches over time. Then we see that the number of speeches increases over time. We see that the government has more speeches than the opposition, but that's clear because that's by order of the Bundestag. The number of speeches and the time of speeches depends on the share of the parties, and the government has a higher share than the others, so they have more speeches or more speech time. This is length of the speeches. Blue is the original distribution, and then orange is the one after doing this pre-processing steps, so all the pre-processing steps. So it becomes a bit more homogeneous, but still we have a rather large share of pretty short speeches. And of course, there's also no strong base for selecting the lower bound. It's clear that very short statements are more of technical nature, or interjections and so on, which are not informative for what we are interested in. But whether the limit is 100 or 80 or 120, that's, but if we say 100, nobody asks. If we say 99.5%, it's a bit strange. Okay. Then it comes to our indicators. And this is a combination of dictionary and embedding base. So we start with a dictionary, first from the speeches. So what terms do we find in the speeches which we relate as experts, as economists, or to fiscal policy? Then we also, I think we extended a little bit by manifesto data, where you also find terms which may not show up in the Bundestag speeches. And then we have a vocabulary. Then everything will be embedded in a rolling window way, similar to what Jonas is doing, not exactly the same, but in a rolling window version. And then we search in the embeddings the vectors corresponding to our dictionary elements, and everything close to that is then expansionary or contractionary. So we have both. We have two dictionaries for both components. Well, that's one. I think we have a little bit more details on that in a minute. Topic modeling is just, that's not recursive in the current version. It's just for the full sample, trying to find what are the topics people talk about in order then to split them up in this more endogenous, exogenous, or neutral topics. And it was done by expert interviews. And the expert interviews, I think, were the 4 of us and then another 4 external, trying to say exogenous or endogenous. Okay. Oh, that's all here what I just said. So we have 163 no, 222 words after doing this expansion, and then they were labeled by us to be expansionary, neutral, or contradictionary. I think I don't have examples directly on my slide, but I have the full list in the appendix if you want to see what's terms. But I mean, tax increase is contractionary, tax decrease is expansionary, budget deficit is typically more contractionary, and so on. I have some examples. Okay, so we come up with 120 expansionary terms. Of course, the economic stimulus program, if they say we shouldn't do an economic stimulus program, okay. But if somebody uses the word, typically it will be more often in a positive sense. I would guess. Also Steuerentlastung, you would not say we shouldn't do Steuerentlastung, you would say we should increase taxes. Or the rich should also contribute. But you wouldn't say I don't want Steuerentlastung. Up to us or to somebody else to check what happens if we take that into account. And then the contractual terms could be tax increase or budgetary discipline, and 90-something other terms. I think we're to back embeddings meanwhile are probably familiar to you. What they're doing more or less. That's something I just also learned a few days ago, that we only use dimension 100. So typically people suggest you should use between 100 and 300 dimensional projections of our space, which has the dimension 93,000, because each word has its own dimension. And that's really huge. And so we project it in a smaller space, but 100 dimensional space for a mathematician doesn't matter, but in practice it's really still a big thing. And this projection takes into account the sequence of words in the sentences. So here we have to take the context into account to some extent. That's the Nikolov paper strategy from Google 2004 or 14? 14, I think it's very recent, all this technology. So searching which words show up together in the text typically, they are then also embedded close to each other in this 100 dimensional space. Well, this is a claim. So Nikolov claims in this paper that this embedded vectors have an additive property. I've never seen anything close to a mathematical proof or whatsoever. It's just a claim. So the claim is, and that's a picture you then often see. First, I cannot draw very well in 100 dimensions. And also the original draft is not in 100 dimensions, but it says, okay, one vector might be the queen. And then this might be a woman. Then you take the queen and you subtract the woman, and then you would end up at the king. I think that's the story, roughly more or less. That's what they mean by additive. No, it's not. You subtract the woman, and you have, sorry, I was too fast, and you have to add the man. So you have to add the man, and then you end up with the king. That's the story. And I've never seen that with real data, and you will see a plot, something where we try to do something with real data. So I'm not so sure about the quality, but given that Google is earning billions of dollars with this methodology, it seems to work well in a certain sense. If you are aware of some literature discussing that in detail, what's going on there, I would be happy to learn more. The embedding is clear. The embedding is simple. You look at the words which are close to the word you are considering, and then basically you count that, and you do, well, it's not a linear projection, it's a nonlinear projection, so it's a neural network which is running there, and that makes it a bit black box-like. And we do that both for the speeches and for the word vector, so we can embed everything in the same space. And this dynamic approach is not the Riga approach, but the Kampham et al. Approach, so from the group from last life under source root, is to do the dynamic. So we do it for 10 years. So we train this embedding for a period of 10 years. at a quarterly frequency, and then everything is embedded, and that's used for the next quarter prediction, let's say, of the speeches coming up in the next quarter. So we don't use the full sample to learn, but we use the path to learn and then apply it always to the next quarter to make it in a way, really ex ante, apart from the topic model, which is not yet. Then we can construct expansionary and contractionary vectors, which is just the sum of the terms. Use the additive property, take the sum of them, and see how close our speeches are to such a vector. So we have the vector queen, and if we have one of the speeches is close to here, then it might be the speech for the coronation of the queen, because it's very close to it. So that's the idea. And then we standardize it to -1 to 1. Our picture trying to explain that. So that's where we do the modeling, that's where we do the forecasting, and that's the indicator we use. Then we repeat the story for the next thing, and then it's going through. And here we have our exponential vector, and then we have the speeches close to the expansionary vector or close to the contractionary vector, and this gives our indicator, which we will see on the next slide. No, not on the next slide. On the next slide, I try to do something, and I still don't know whether it's a good idea, but I try to do something like this with real data, but maybe not in the most clever way. So it's a two-dimensional projection, obviously. The green points are these expansionary terms, and the red ones are the contractionary. Everything seems still a bit mixed, but it's only two-dimensional. And I oriented the projection in a way such that the aggregated contractionary vector, which is the red one, and the aggregated expansionary vector are orthogonal to each other. So I didn't order them to be 180 degrees, but 90 degrees. Because it's something different. Convection is not just minus expansion. Okay, we can look for speeches. Here I show you just one speech. That's the Scholz speech, the Bazooka speech, or at the beginning of the Corona pandemic. And that now should convince you that the concept somehow makes sense, because that's probably one of the most expansionary speeches we ever had in history. And it is very right out on the expansionary side, and it's very down on the contractionary side. So the most expansionary stuff should be out here. And the fact that you only find a few words further out, this is really, to me, it's impressive, because that's the mean of all the words for the whole speech. It's not one word. I mean, to have one word cuts taxes to 0. That's not one word, but and it's very close to the single terms which are really expensive. But of course, I think the problem with these projections, of course, you can choose any projection, and probably you can show everything with the projection. And so the only story I can tell, I told you how I constructed the projection. And if you find that sensible, then this is a good argument. If you find it nonsenseless, then also the argument is discounted. I think it also made it just to the appendix to the paper. But the referees also found it probably not so interesting. That's now our indicator. Based on that, and we have blue for the full Bundestag, orange for the opposition, and green for government. And you see periods where the opposition is more expensive than the government. Of course, as an opposition, you can always ask to cut taxes and to spend more on this and that, because you don't have to care about the budget. Easy. We see that's the European debt crisis. So there was a common understanding that now we need to be restrictive. And that's the beginning of the Corona pandemic. Well, that's the most expansionary phase in speeches we have seen over this 50 years, more or less. But there's still a lot of noise. So that's the indicator. And I guess with the shaded areas, these are the official recession periods. You wonder what this these areas. These are recessions, oil price shock 1, oil price shock 2, German unification, or dot bubble burst, outcome bubble burst, and this is the financial market crisis. Typically, when people construct this type of textual indicators, they put labels on some points and say, okay, in this point, we understand what's going on, as I did now for the Corona pandemic. Of course, you can do that, but in a way, I described how we constructed the indicator, and then it's more or less, this is more illustration that it could make sense maybe. The side remark on the exogenous versus endogenous fiscal sentiment, the definition we use, exogenous policy decision does not offset other macroeconomic shocks. So it's not unemployment goes up and we offset it by spending more on unemployment support or so, but it's real exogenous shock, not coming, not as a reaction to something from the economy, maybe to a reaction to something else. And that's why we want to focus on speeches on topics like infrastructure, military, social justice, etc., which are not belonging to this economic reaction stuff like social security system, labor market, etc. It's an LDA model with 100 topics, without checking whether that's the optimal number. I also have something in my slide to show you how you should select the number of topics, because then meanwhile we have a method to do that properly, statistically based. And then we use the relevance of such a topic in the speech, the weight of the topic in the speech, multiplied with the fiscal sentiment to get an exogenous fiscal sentiment indicator and an endogenous fiscal sentiment indicator. That's the way we constructed this too. Just to show you two examples, one topic is military, which we consider as being rather exogenous to macroeconomic shocks. So you don't spend more on military because oil prices are high, but because you see some global changes going on and you think it's a clever idea to do so. There are words showing up in this topic, so I think that's quite okay. And another example was budget. That's of course something completely endogenous, or depending on the economic decision or on the economic situation, tax income, expenditures for the social security system, everything is driven by economy. So this is typically endogenous. And there we have the budget, we have debt, we have the official budget, and so we consider that more to be an endogenous. But again, this was labeled by the authors and trying to achieve agreement on which topics are exogenous or endogenous or neutral. Of course, there are also topics which have nothing to do with the story here, and then they are considered to be neutral. This is how these indicators look like. That's the aggregate one over all speeches. And again, for the Corona pandemic, we see that the exogenous part is quite high. There's also a positive sentiment in the endogenous part, but the exogenous component seems to be the driving one, which might not be convincing here. That's German unification. Also, we could see German unification was not driven by economic situation, at least not in West Germany. And so it makes sense to have that more on the exogenous side. Whereas oil price shock reaction, that seems to be more endogenous stuff. We have the shock and then we have to deal with it. Okay. This is our fiscal sentiment for this episode, and then you see again, that's not allowed to be one at the beginning. For COVID, it's more an exogenous thing, and sorry, for also. But for the oil price trade, it was more an endogenous thing, as I just explained. Yeah, I'm not sure I might have a bug here. And for the financial market crisis, also it's not something exogenous happening. It's coming from the system and automatic reaction. I have to check this. Disagreement. Now we aggregate the speeches to the parties. and then split them up to the parties belonging to the government and to the opposition, or within the government, and calculate these disagreement indicators, sentiment for the governing parties and the opposition, or within government. And for the most recent period, of course, we had 3 parties in the government. It's not on the slide, it's just in the appendix. There we use then the maximum of the pairwise distances. So probably that's FDP and Grüne, I guess, but whatever it is, the maximum of the different distances will be considered as disagreement in the 3-party coalition. And these are the numbers. This is the government opposition. The blue lines are just the smooth version of the gray line. Maybe make it a bit better to see. And here we have marked end of the social liberal coalition in 1983 and the resigning of Minister of Finance Lafontaine in 1999, just after the beginning of the red-green government. And we see, so we are more interested in within government disagreement, and there you see prior to the splitting up, the disagreement increased sharply, and the same year, prior to resigning of Lafontaine, also we had a strong increase in disagreement. And then at the end, this is prior to the start of the Ampel, we had also a high increase in disagreement at the end of the last Merkel chancellorship between SPD and CDU. Continuing that, then you find spikes somewhere up here for the end of the Ampel. And that was this honeymoon cycle. At the beginning, in the government, everything is fine. It's even going down a little bit. So people start giving each other the first name and this stuff. But then towards the end, it's going the other way around. Then the disagreement increases because they have to show profile for the next elections, probably. Well, I will be a bit shorter now on this VR models because there are so many of them in the paper, but the story is always the same. So we use a reduced form VR model for the economy. We add our sentiment indicator as an additional variable. We have to think about the ordering, is it coming first or last? We do robustness checks and so on, and want to figure out what is the impact of an unexpected fiscal sentiment shock or of an unexpected change in disagreement about fiscal sentiment. And in our base model, I think we have the government expenditures, we have the GDP, we have consumption, and we have our fiscal sentiment, which in the standard version, in the aggregate version, is ordered last. So it may react in the same period to changes going on, which might be a sensible idea to do so. Well, I don't want to go through all these different versions we did with different variables just to see whether it's a random finding or whether it's robust if we add alternative variables. Of course, we couldn't add all of them given the limitations by the degrees of freedom, but we try with the different versions. And then we have our dummy time plan, and we have an impulse dummy for the second quarter of 2020 because of the extreme values we had in GDP and consumption in that year. Eight quarters lag. Well, here's the argument of why we order the speeches last, because we say at least government expenditures will be fixed already at that time, and yeah. And that's why we don't claim that our VR model identifies unexpected government spending shocks, because that's not what we need. We are looking at the effect of our fiscal sentiment shocks. That's what we are interested in. And later on, but we could also show that the fiscal spending shocks you typically draw from such a VR model without the sentiment can be explained to some extent by the fiscal sentiment. So they are not shocks. You can predict them based on the speeches. That's why we think our approach might be a more robust thing. This is shows now the responses to an increase in fiscal sentiment. Or the solid line is reaction to government, and the dashed line is responding to the whole parliament. Just to see whether it makes a difference. We see here for consumption, for example, it makes a quantitative difference, but qualitatively it doesn't make so much a difference between the two. And we see, well, as expected, positive sentiment shock will lead to increased expenditures. At least for the government, it's natural. If the government parties become more expansionary, then they will spend more in the future. This will have a positive impact on GDP growth and also on consumption. And the shock itself seems to be it's not unit-root, but it has a certain persistence, but not very long. Then, next step, split up the sentiment, exogenous versus endogenous. All of the exogenous one first, because we assume this is not linked to current, so our decision on military expenditures is not linked to the current value of GDP, for example, but the endogenous sentiment still is at the end. Doing the same analysis, now shock of the exogenous component. Here we only have the all, so not split up government, and it's just everything. And we see again increase in government expenditures, and GDP and consumption, and an increase in the endogenous sentiment, which also goes to zero. And typically we don't look too much at the y-axis in this VR models, but I would like to point out that nevertheless it's 0.5% of GDP. So one standard shock in fiscal sentiment, not in expenditures. If the parliament says, okay, let's spend money, then one standard deviation shock increases GDP within a period of 2 years by 0.5%. That's huge. That's 2%, or it's 60 billion. 60 billion. No, 60 billion. 60 billion euro. So we were surprised to see that the effects are so clear. We didn't expect that, given the noise in the indicator, and that the size is so large. And then we received also feedback from reviewers. They said, well, that's unrealistic to have this large multipliers, but we could find some literature using different models also coming up with large multipliers. And so we could convince them that's what our data say. Endogenous fiscal sentiment shocks, not much. Everybody knows what's going on, and so nothing really significant. Nothing is significant, I think, here. No, we don't see anything. And so that's what the argument I just stated. So we would state that the traditional government spending shocks, which we are used in macroeconomics to consider as fiscal policy shocks, are not, because to some extent we explain them by something we can observe, namely the speeches. So we could guess the traditional shocks from a VR model on our indicators, and this has explanatory power. Then the same for disagreement. I think that's the last VRs I want to show. And then we are coming to the end, I think 10 more minutes or so. There we use the disagreement. Yes, the disagreement index. We use the disagreement index. So the disagreement between government and opposition, or the within government disagreement, which is the more important thing. Here we use a slightly larger VR model, also including the stock market, because this is the second paper. So I should have said the first paper is already published in the European Economic Review, and the second paper is currently in the revised, under revision. The first we are doing right now, the first revision. So here we assume that this disagreement might contemporaneously affect the stock market, which we have seen, but not the real GDP or something in the same period. So that's why we don't order it last, but a little bit earlier. But we also tried the ordering proposed by Blanchard and Perotti, and qualitatively the results are, in this regard, they are quite robust. And then we see again quite strong increase in GDP, well, now based on disagreement. But now we don't have the story about government expenditures, because our indicator says if there should be a decrease. Our indicator says if there's a decrease. Sorry, no, that's government opposition. That might be the case. That's not the slide I wanted to show. Sorry, I had too many slides. Or this is the story I want to say. Okay, the responsive increase in disagreement. Now it's correct within the government. We see this leads to a substantial fall in GDP, which is not moderated by the government spending. Because the disagreement does neither lead to more spending nor to less spending, because they cannot find a common way, so it remains more or less unchanged, but still it has a real impact. So that's a different story from the story before. So that's a different indicator. And well, the size is a bit smaller here, 0.2 percentage points, but it's only cheap talk. I mean, it's not decisions made, it's cheap talk or best cheap talk in the government, because we assume that the transmission goes through uncertainty. If you don't know whether there will be subventions for buying an e-car next quarter or not, you will not buy it now, because you might think, well, maybe there will be something, because they are not clear about that, and then you don't do it. If you want to invest in production of hydrogen, and one party is telling you, well, that's our future, and the other party tells you we should be open to fossil oil, then you will not do it. You will wait until they have settled the dispute and made a decision, and that has a contractionary effect. And it's measurable. And that's really, we were impressed by the results, to see that it's really, and it's robust. I mean, we also have many different versions of this model testing. Well, I don't want to show all this robustness test. There was one story I came up with, but which seems to be not the relevant story. Sometimes in history in Germany, if the majority in the parliament differs from the majority in the Bundesrat, which is the second chamber, then often the government had to make deals, so paying something to the lender to make them vote in favor of the proposals which need both agreement by the parliament and by the Bundesrat. And so we thought maybe the constellation of Bundesrat versus Bundestag has an impact on how this disagreement works, what the impact is. And that's why we controlled for the share of the government in the Bundesrat. But as you see, well, compared with the previous slide, you don't see anything. So it was just an idea, but it doesn't seem to be important. Also, the changes were substantial in the composition of the Bundesrat. Was the Bundesrat or still more? Yeah, one variation was also to take into account this cycle. We have found the disagreement at the cycle, so we put in also a cubic spline in a way to model, to allow for a trend within each election period, but this does not take out the effect. So it's not automatic, it's really, they have to make it on purpose, the disagreement. This automatic increase is not driving the results. So, obviously. We have the one on impact, yeah, okay. And so my expectation was right, it's a little bit larger, but it's robust. We care more about robustness than about saying, okay, this is a perfect ordering. That's last slide with this responses to disagreement in a really large model, I think with 8 variables, and one is the government and opposition is the blue, and the leasing government is the orange. And you see that they differ quite markedly sometimes. You put them one factorings away, but overall picture is stable, that this disagreement has real effects. That's a slide which was very up to date when I had it in for the first time. This was namely just after the collapse of the Ampel. government, and there is about, I think this is our uncertainty index. No, it's direct. No, it's direct. It's the return of the asset market. So once this government with a lot of disagreement broke up, uncertainty decreased and returns increased. But you shouldn't do statistics with one observation, I guess. It's more an illustration than statistics. So let me conclude. So this novel methods from natural language processing allow us to construct new indices, and in particular, in our case, a new index for fiscal sentiment and disagreement about fiscal policy from parliamentary speeches, which provide new insights into macroeconomic shocks, namely the fiscal policy shock. And that's the first time you can see that for German data. For fiscal policy. There's monetary policy, it's a bit, we have a lot of papers the last few years, but nobody seems to do it with fiscal policy so far. And disagreement has real effects. And that's of course very good timing of the paper that we have just finished it when the most disharmonic government broke up. In the future work, one idea would be to look a bit closer on the revenue side of public finance, but there's a data limitation in Germany. We don't have too many data for that. And of course, further refinement of the textual indicators. We discussed already some natural ideas. If it would be not in a statistics department, but in a data science department, people would argue, why don't we use LLMs for doing that? The answer is, of course, you can. You could construct the indicator also based on LLMs. Maybe 3 years ago, a bit difficult. Nowadays, they're easier. Whether it's better, I don't know. Then we don't make a difference between national and EU fiscal policy, which of course over the last 20 years is quite important for Germany. And this might provide further detailed insights. And then what would also be a natural extension would be to say, effectiveness of fiscal policy in the traditional ways of government spending, thus a change there has a different impact depending on the level of disagreement we have. So is there kind of an interaction or non-linearity in the effect? That would also be, I think, a natural extension to think about when continuing to work on this type of model. I guess that's all I wanted to tell you, but I'm open to all further questions you might have. Thanks for your attention.